been a great year. I was unfortunately out of town when we had our big event, but it was certainly a major milestone in the history of Port Columbus. And I'm looking forward to hopefully coming back for the 100th if I'm in good health. I don't expect to still be working here in 25 years, but look forward to opening up the time capsule and seeing how much things have changed in 25 years.
I'm now very honored and pleased to tell you about a very exciting program. Recall Don Casto Sr. and Edgar Wolfe Sr. and their pivotal roles in the history of this airport? Well, most of you are well aware that those families have continued to shape the future of our great city. The Wolfe family has always been a strong supporter of Columbus, and Don Casto III is the former chair of our board and continues to serve on our board today. These are great families, and they have joined together to establish the Casto Wolfe Aviation Scholarship, and have founded it for 5 years. Give a round of applause. We are so pleased to advance the legacy of these great families with this scholarship opportunity for students of aviation. 2 students will be selected annually, and each will receive a $2,000 scholarship. 1 student will be selected from the aviation management field, and the other from the field of aviation maintenance. It is my pleasure now to introduce Don Casto III.
Thank you, Snoopy. I'm pleased to be here, and Kathy has stolen a little bit of my thunder by giving you some of the history, and I've been asked to just maybe flesh that out a little bit and share with you a few anecdotes that will give you a flavor of sort of what transpired in 1928 in trying to get this airport off the ground. We have a lot of political leaders here today, and I think they understand the need for publicity and community involvement, and that was probably lacking in 1927 when the bond issue failed. Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Casto Sr. Got together again, picked themselves off the mat, and decided that it was time to try again, but this time they were going to do it a little better. I don't know much about Mr. Wolfe, and I can only tell you that he sure did his share of the job, and clearly deserves equal credit with my grandfather, but since I knew my grandfather and had the benefit of a little bit of oral history, I'll spend some time sharing with you some of what he told me. His nephew, John Bob, is here today as well, so the two of us sort of represent his memory. He was a great entrepreneurial spirit and an excellent promoter. He had a little bit of a P.T. Barnum DNA in him. In addition to that, he was a visionary leader and a real believer in the future of Columbus. And together with Edgar Wolfe, they teamed up in 1928. His personal history was a bit testy. He was orphaned here in Columbus as a young boy. His father was a traveling salesman for International Harvester and passed away on a trip through Columbus and left a surviving son. So my granddad grew up as a ward of the state for his high school years and lived above a pool hall just across from Ohio State University. And he was a pretty mean shot. I can tell you, I could never beat him. He matriculated in Ohio State and was part of the same class. In fact, was a classmate of James Thurber. So that gives you some idea of the era. Not being much of a student and more of an entrepreneur and promoter, and caught up in the frenzy of the early days of World War I, he enrolled in the Lafayette Brigade, which was actually American soldiers who were enrolled in the French Army prior to America's declaration of war. So he was over there pretty much ahead of everybody else. Much to my great delight, subsequent delight, he survived. I wouldn't be here without him, but about 50% of his cohorts over there didn't survive, so it was a pretty brutal experience. I returned to Columbus and began selling houses in Upper Arlington, or what is now Upper Arlington, what was then a very new neighborhood. it really became sort of a residential. He started building his own houses then and selling them, became a single-family developer, became a residential visionary, and in 1928, really a retail visionary, because the same year that we had the bond issue pass here, he opened the very first shopping center in the world on Grandview Avenue. It still stands. It was called the Bank Block because it had two banks in it. He built it because it was an amenity to help sell houses in Upper Arlington, which was then perceived to be far removed from downtown. So he had a promotional streak. He had clearly a visionary, and he really believed that all great cities in the world were port cities, and that Columbus couldn't be a great city until it had a port. He looked around, didn't see an ocean, and he remembered his World War I experience in the battlefields over there. He got to know Eddie Rickenbacker. He knew a lot of the World War I aces and was caught up in the romance of flying, but was able to make the connection between aviation and looking ahead to the future and how aviation could make Columbus, he felt, a great city. He also believed in promotion, and the Graf Zeppelin's part of this, but for example, in 1928, when the Bank Block opened, it was Spanky and our gang, and all those people showed up. I remember as a child watching Grandma Carter, a 75-year-old grandmother, dive off a 80-foot tower at shopping center parking lots into a flaming wet sponge. You know, how you persuade a 75-year-old lady to do that, I don't know, but he did. And so it was that kind of promotional streak that he was always thinking in those terms. But he had to execute the vision, he and Mr. Wolfe. And first thing they understood to execute the vision of this vibrant airport was the need for money, which was the bond issue. Money needed public support, and public support was certainly capable of being generated by the newspaper. But the newspaper, as Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Casto talked, needed a hook. They needed something to figure out, what can you talk about? You can educate the public all you want, talk about the aviation, but eventually they turned the page. They needed something beyond that. He came up with the idea of because he had heard from a friend of his who was from World War I days, who was Secretary of the Navy, that the Graf Zeppelin was making its maiden voyage. It was perfect timing because it was taking off in October, late October, right prior to the bond issue. His idea was to be the first passenger ever to cross the Atlantic by air. So he wangled his way on board, paid his passage, and this was really, when you think of it in context, this was only 1 year after Lindbergh's crossing. The rationale was to inspect German airfields, so that we build the right airfield here. We all know that's probably a lot of hooey, but he in fact did inspect a number of airfields. The trip was very simple. It was a departure from Lakehurst, New Jersey. Instead of going directly what we think of as the Great Circle route to Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance, the Graf Zeppelin was significantly underpowered, and it was quickly blown off course over northern Greenland, then headed back toward Friedrichshafen and was again blown off course over Morocco. So it sort of did the Atlantic sideways. The captain of the Graf Zeppelin was Dr. Hugo Echner, a very famous proponent of dirigibles, and in his career he flew the Graf Zeppelin for 500 transatlantic crossings, and then subsequently captained the Hindenburg. He retired from service rather than continue because he objected to the Nazi use of dirigibles for propaganda purposes. In any case, they arrived in Friedrichshafen. The trip was otherwise uneventful. In his absence, the bond issue passed. He took a steamer trip home. Prior to his departure, I think this is probably one of the only family anecdotes that's worth repeating. In order to get permission from my grandmother, Mrs. Casto, to take the trip, he had to take out the then huge life insurance policy of $1,000. Upon hearing from him in Paris that the trip was successful and he'd arrived, she cashed in the life insurance policy and bought a fur coat. So, but I hope that gives you a little flavor, and thanks for having me here today.